This is David Duffy, the founder and CEO of the Governance Company. We are a global provider of online and offline corporate governance services headquartered in Dublin, Ireland. The topic of today's broadcast is the art of chairing a board. I am joined today by a stellar group of chairs: Frances Rowan, Chair of the Abbey Theatre and recently appointed Chair of the Irish National Competitive Council, Dermot Breen, the Chair of the Irish Cancer Society, and John Reynolds, the Chair of the very successful housing building company Cairn Homes plc. So perhaps before we start, I might ask each of our participants just to give us a very brief introduction, maybe starting with Dermot.
Hi there. Well, I've been chairing the Irish Cancer Society for the past 3 years, and I have another year to go on my term of office. But I've been on the board since 2008, and I was originally asked by the then chair to come on board as a kind of patient voice, but somebody also from a business background who would have an understanding of governance and management and organisation direction. So it was applying the business in a sort of non-executive capacity, applying the business principles and your business knowledge over the years, I felt always added value. And I think because a lot of the Irish not-for-profits actually need that business perspective, because I think organisationally they will be better off with it. Not exclusively, but it does add enormous value. And so I've added that value over the years, and I think as chair you're in a stronger position to even add that value even more and even greater, to have greater effect. So it's a very satisfying experience to be on a board of a charity, particularly when you realise that the cause that is at its foundation. And you can achieve a lot in terms of applying your knowledge to it, and there's real value in that.
Frances.
So I've been in the Abbey Theatre for just over 2 years as chair, but I come from a background of 30 years in Trinity, and then I was head of the SRI. So I there had a board which I was reporting to, and I think I learned quite a lot from being at the other side of that experience as CEO. And I've been on a lot of other boards as members over the years. So what I suppose I'm bringing to it is not the knowledge of the art in a general sense, although I should say that I have every single programme for the Abbey Theatre that I've attended back to 1969. So there's a sense in which I had a long-standing interest. But I suppose what I bring to it is a lot of experience of being in a lot of other places in both the public and the private sector that's relevant to what goes on in the Abbey.
John?
I've been chair of Cairn Homes since the company's inception. Was invited to take over that role by the founders of the company, who at the time had the vision of raising very substantial monies and using that money to build homes in Ireland. Their vision had been to identify the obvious disjoin between supply and demand, which existed at that point and continues to exist. In approaching me, their aspiration was to get the benefit of my experience in governance. My background was a career in banking, been a director of companies since the mid-90s, and obviously worked in a regulated environment.
So you've all become chairs. I'm just wondering, before you considered becoming a chair, did you seek advice anywhere? Did you get training? Because it's a very different position from being, a director or a non-exec director on a board.
I didn't get advice specifically. Becoming non-executive director, I took advice in advance because I saw the transition from executive director to non-executive director to be more dramatic, or at least it seemed as such to me at the time, and therefore I canvassed some views and insights from experienced non-executive directors. In looking at the chair position, it seemed a natural evolution from one's role as a director. You're right, there are significant differences, but there are differences that I'd had the chance to observe over a long number of years.
I would have done quite a bit of training as in a non-executive role on other boards. Mm-hmm. So that I think that kind of comes into play. Mm-hmm. But what I think certainly happened for me was I'd been on a variety of different kinds of boards over many years, going way back to the 80s, in fact. And what I'd seen is very different kinds of chairing, very different kinds of boards. And what I find is sort of reflecting very often on those experiences, you realise you know an awful lot. So it's much more like learning on the job rather than training. That said, I think that I think training is always a useful thing to have, and I think most boards have some kind of renewal process during every year, and I think everybody, you might say I learnt nothing specifically new, but actually something gets refreshed or something gets reinforced. So I'm in favour of the mixture of having a lot of experience on boards before you become a chair.
Dermot, a question for you would be, what would be the top attributes that make a really good chair in your view?
Board experience, I think, is terribly important. And some experience as chair is certainly helpful, but certainly board experience and as diverse a board experience as possible. But I think a good attribute of a chair needs to be independent-minded, needs to be governance knowledged and aware and able to execute governance principles, has a good engagement with people and can engage, for example, with the CEO is terribly important to reach the management through that. But I think a key part of it is to understanding the principles of the business. And certainly in the charity, it's understanding having some affinity to the cause makes a big difference. And in a PLC, I would certainly see that it's having some financial or commercial acumen. In a state sector, it's based on the sort of the skill set of what's involved there. But I think there are some, in a charity, I would say affinity to a cause is terribly important as a starting point. But then the other attributes such as governance, independent of thinking, people relationships and so on are all very important attributes.
What particular soft skills do you think a good chair is bring to the table?
I think the ability to read a room is important. Obviously, to understand the dynamic within the board in that situation, but also then to have the emotional intelligence to bring the best out of the board members. Sometimes people default to conflict management. It's actually, I think sometimes the harder part is to generate a degree of dynamism and energy in the room as opposed to conflict management. Conflict management is relatively straightforward. It's very manifest, but people being either withdrawn because they're being reticent or because they haven't found their groove in the context of the board. I think a chair has to have the capacity just to manage that dynamic.
Could I sort of add to that? I mean, I think the ability to listen and being seen to listen, because I've seen chairs where actually they were listening, but people didn't feel they were being heard as a consequence. So I think that's part of the reading of the room thing that you've just raised. I think very often as chair, which you don't need as a member, is that ability to analyse and synthesise and bring things together. And in order to do that, it is key to be able to get the big picture. Because it is incredible how people can take one element of something and let that dominate. And I think, when you're chairing well, you're keeping that big picture in mind all the time. Going back to John's point, I would tend to think of it as kind of about infusing energy and defusing tension.
So when you chair board meetings, what's a good outcome for you out of a board meeting?
A clear decision.
Yeah, clear decision in relation to all of the items. People making it clear that clear decision could actually be, we need to come back to this in a bigger scale. Because sometimes something comes to a table which in fact hasn't been thought through and you suddenly realise it means a much bigger think. But it's got to be clear that what is the decision? If you're going to come back to this at the next board meeting or at the next second but one, what is it you want for that board meeting? So I think the clarity of decision and actions so that people leave the meeting feeling they know what's happened. And I think the following up with very precise board action minutes is absolutely crucial, because when you're in the room and if there's an intense discussion, people switch in and switch out at different stages, just not through any disregard, just as the human condition. So you want to make sure that what those decisions that have been made are then reinforced and people are very, very clear. And that can sometimes be difficult in organisations where minutes lag, which happens very often in the public sector. The minutes lag long after the board meeting, and I think that's unfortunate. So,
what sort of leadership responsibilities does a chair have in trying to get an outcome out of a meeting? So, you do all the business that needs to be done. Are you trying to inspire people coming out of it, or is that just occasionally, or the strategy away day, or what?
I think it's the clarity of purpose at the beginning and at the end. What I think you're trying to do is facilitate progress being achieved by this collective of individuals made up of perhaps management and the rest of the board. So I think if the chair is being effective, she or he will have set out the objectives of the meeting and then will be mindful in making sure there's progress to the achievement of those objectives.
So another question here that I'm keen to get your view on. When you're all, quite experienced in what you do, but what's the biggest issue you've had to deal with in a boardroom that you can talk about as chair in a boardroom?
I think a good board is likely to have quite different personalities on it. And I think that if you're coming into a continuum as chair, which typically will normally would evolve out of having been a director of the boards, how you get the best out of that mix of personalities is a very basic part of the chair role, and I think every chair, every director actually could probably think of periods and incidents where that chemistry between the different personalities has given rise to periods of instability. So I think the war stories tend to always revolve around personalities and how they see their particular role, and I think without being specific, that's where it's been at.
So talking generically, just supposing there was a dominating person in the room which is kind of making it difficult to get business done, I mean, what should people listening to this podcast think about?
Well, as chair, I can picture the situation, and if I might just give an experience, I would say it's not on the board that I'm on, it's on another board that I had. There was one member of the board who would turn up at occasional meetings and was a very forceful presence when he or she was speaking, and interjected his or her thoughts on a particular point, on a particular decision, made it loud, even though the position may have been discussed at the previous meeting. He stamped his authority or his view on the whole situation. Now, in a very loud way, in a very forceful way. So the challenge there is to see that in context and to address the fact that we had discussed this previously. This is part of an ongoing discussion. I mean, and that we're well past the point that he may well have wished to raise and to take up. But it is a challenge, and sometimes it needs a bit of offside discussion outside of the meeting to fill in the context of the situation, understand where the rest of the board is at, so that there isn't a sort of a lone voice shouting from the back of the room. And that can happen. And again, that's a personality issue that has to be managed. And there are ways of managing that without necessarily putting it on the table at the meeting. But it may need the end of the meeting to actually deal with that.
There are two things that I think are useful there, and you've just mentioned one of them, which is having conversations outside of the board meeting in the right kind, in a structured, positive way, as in a kind of other than a corrective way. Sometimes these things are due to the perspectives, because you've got the diversity of people coming from a different place. So somebody maybe has a legal background or an accounting background or a tech background, and they see something very passionately about this which they can't manage to share with everybody else, and they may not see in the heat of the moment that they're losing people rather than actually convincing them. So I think one of the things is, as a chair, is to try to stand back and try to make sure that position isn't lost. And I think the other thing that's useful is which I would have had come across, it's kind of old style at this stage, but having the non-execs session at the end of every board meeting, I think, is really very useful, because there's a sense in which people are in a more relaxed mode. It's not being minuted in the same way. It's just listening to people say, well, look, we think that went well, or that paper wasn't as strong as it needed to be to convince us to do that, or what we need is, and it gives that moment of reflection afterwards. And I think if people have been disappointed by something that happened at the board, it tends to come up there in a more relaxed sort of way, and I think that's important.
There's been a lot of discussion about culture in recent times here with the establishment of the Irish Banking Culture Board. I'm just wondering to what extent, your boards think about culture. Is it an agenda item, or is it kind of an evolving thing going forward?
I mean, I think there's one piece which, in an arts environment, which I think is probably slightly different to other environments, although everybody can always see the differences, and the similarities are much stronger than the differences actually in terms of boards. But is that some people are more comfortable about the governance pieces as they fit together, and in particular that they're very happy about thinking strategically. And say in the arts area, that's not a thing that most people do. They might have their individual strategic goals, but it's not articulated in that way. There isn't the same sort of language that they're as comfortable with. So the danger is that, for me, one of the biggest challenges was bringing through the Abbey and use, its first ever sort of corporate strategy, and trying to get everybody to buy into that within the organisation, sort of bottom up and top down pieces, elements involved. But what was really crucial there was to keep everybody connected with it. And if you're in theatre, it's the next project, it's what's the next thing on the stage. It's very immediate, it's very operational, it's very crisis management. So there isn't the natural energy there for strategy, and yet strategy is the piece that helps you to guide you in the overall picture, and actually in its execution generally mitigates the risks of potential crises along the way. So I think for me, in the arts side, that was one of the bigger pieces, was trying to get a cross-section of the board and indeed of the organisation to understand where strategy fitted in their world.
Yeah, I think I have always identified the sort of key sort of attributes or key responsibilities of a chair being governance, leadership, strategy and risk. And I think in the last couple of years what I will have done is added a fifth one, and it is culture. And I think it is a key need of the board to address the whole culture situation very closely with the chief executive and the management team and the executive team, because a board can't do that on its own. You have to relate to what the culture is. The culture is actually within the organisation, deep down. And I think it does need addressing, and I think the time to do it actually is at the strategy sessions. Yeah. And when you're doing a corporate strategy or a strategic planning process, to incorporate a culture discussion around that and identifying the strengths and weaknesses in the culture we have, and then identifying how it can be improved and enhanced. But it is going to be very much the job of the CEO to take it there. So the CEO has to be very central to that whole discussion. But culture is key to sort of performance, talent retention, talent attraction, the financial performance, delivery performance of an organisation. Culture can make the correct culture can make such an enormous difference.
Isn't that famous line, culture eats strategy for breakfast? Right. So there's a sense in which what gets prioritised, you can have the strategic plans and strategic focus, but what gets prioritised will in fact be influenced by what's coming through the culture of the organisation.
That's right.
So quite an operational point now is that, you're chairing your first board meeting. There's probably two aspects to this. You're coming in for the first time as a chair and you don't know the rest, or you don't know that many of them, or you're coming in having been an NED. I don't know if any of you have been in that position, and I think it'd be interesting to get some perspectives on that as to how you prepare for that meeting.
So when I started with the Abbey, what I did was I met each of the board members separately to find out what were their priorities or what were the things that were of greatest concern to those. So I met them all individually. And actually it was very helpful because one of the things they focused on was the absence of strategy within the Abbey. So it was actually a no-brainer to say I had the board fully behind me in wanting to begin to take a more strategic approach to how things were being done. I did one thing which probably was a little bit of a cheat, because at my first board meeting, I was appointed just about 10 days before the first board meeting, enough time to meet everybody. But they had already got somebody in place to chair that meeting. So I said, I will sit in as observer and let that person who was prepared for it, and I thought it was appropriate to let them go. So in a sense, I sort of got a sense of how the board worked. So I didn't have to walk in and do that for the first time. So I think when you're walking in for the first time, it would be essential to have had a lot of discussions with people beforehand, and also have a discussion about how the board operates with them. And again, the board members had given me not just the need for strategy, but they had some issues around how the board had been operating and what would need to be done.
And in this case, you weren't on the board previously?
I wasn't on the board previously, so it was entirely new.
Yeah.
My own experience is primarily as chair is having coming from a non-executive position and being on the board for a number of years and being aware and having actively enlisted a number of the other board members for the skills that I saw that would be needed. So that it does help to have that sort of familiarity. However, there is a major advantage also in coming in as a sort of a completely new face with a completely fresh mind and a fresh pair of eyes. And I would think certainly in a crisis situation, I think that's terribly important when there's an identified need for change.
They always say you only get one opportunity to make a first impression. So if you're coming in as a chair out of the blue, the way you prepare for that meeting in whatever way that might be, like what you've done, and how you even open up that meeting, how you run that meeting is incredibly important, because that sets the standard. But also culture and values, because at the end of the day, it all emanates from the chair, that leadership capacity and capability to influence a room. And if that's not there, I think it's harder. So aligning the two is important.
So one of the things that I would have done at the end of the first meeting was which I hadn't shared, so I was kind of doing a crossover between the two approaches, was then in the sort of directors only session or session with the board members only, I basically talked about where I stood, what my values were, what I liked, and the fact that I was very keen on having things very open, that I wanted a strong set of subcommittees, but that those committees reported in strongly to the board, because again I'd had signals that people felt one or two committees were maybe dominating things and we needed a better balance. So I tried to give a sense of my values, having got a sense of how the room worked. I was then in a position to say, well, look, this is, again, a lot of preparation. There's nothing beats preparation. But I had to sort of adjust that then in response to what was actually said into the mood of the meeting.
What advice would you give to people contemplating becoming a chair?
I would say don't go on it unless you've had quite a bit of board experience already. I think that's the absolutely crucial thing. I think you need to have a passion for what it is the board is doing, that you're fairly confident that if the board doesn't have a composition that looks right, so you've done your standard due diligence, okay, but then you're basically saying, is this board in the right shape, let's say in terms of the skill mix? How long would it take to get there? Because if it's going to take a very long time to get there, that's a worry that should come out of your due diligence. But I think it's that feeling that this is going to take an awful lot of your headspace, because I think the role of a chair requires much more headspace than the role of another non-executive board member. That's the big difference.
As much as one can in advance have clarity around what you believe your role as chair is and what the role of the chief executive is, I think the chair has to be very self-aware and have worked out what she or he is going to sort of do by way of challenge and support to the chief executive.
So Francis, you've been a chair of a state board and involved a lot in kind of state boards in some shape or form. Are there any particular challenges you see as being a chair of a state board versus perhaps non-state boards?
I mean, I think the understanding, just what John was saying there, understanding the relationship between the chair and the CEO and the chair and the provider of funding, let's say when it's a state board, or the parent department. Yeah. Now, when I was in the ESRI, I was the CEO of a body that was heavily funded by the state, and we had a relationship with the Department of Finance, as was, or Public Expenditure and Reform, which was not a very tight relationship, but it was well set out and established and fairly clear cut. But I was on at the time, I was on a group called ACASA, which was the Chief Executive Officers of state agencies. And what I was really struck by was, and this was from a CEO point, but it fed back into the boards, what their relationship was like with the parent department. So the CEO can have a particular relationship with the parent department, but the chair then is generally coming in at either ministerial level or Secretary General level. So getting that relationship right is a particular one there. It's like your shareholder. It is in some sense like one of your major shareholders that you have to deal with in a very particular way. And I think that's a major feature of any heavily state-funded body where there's a kind of a regulatory structure that involves you having a relationship into the department.
And more stakeholders to manage. Dermot, any perspectives on it?
Yeah, just from a charity point of view, I think there's a fundamental characteristic of charity is that you're dependent on individual donors primarily and volunteers who are not remunerated, and they actually don't get anything tangible in return for their energy and their efforts or their contribution. Their satisfaction and their return is actually in the giving and in the contributing their time as volunteers. So there's no retribution or recompense involved. And as well as that, at a board level, there's no remuneration, either for their time, for fees, or in most cases for expenses. That the time that they put in and the expenses incurred at their own time. So you're actually asking a lot of your fellow board members to participate, to attend meetings and so on. If there's even minimal remuneration, it changes the whole dynamic and the whole sort of relationship. So it is a key thing. But because of your dependence largely on donors and volunteers, and remember, donors might be only contributing €2 or €3 a year, but they still have the same status as major donors because it's very significant to them. And volunteers, I mean, our organisation has an ongoing pool of about 2,500 volunteers sometimes in a very sort of loose, unstructured way, but some of it very structured. And these volunteers put in a huge amount of time and commitment with absolutely no recompense in any way. They do it for their own self-satisfaction. But so we are very much dependent, and the currency of a charity is actually trust. It's trust with your external donors and trust with the volunteers who work around you. And that becomes the core of the thing. So that changes the whole dynamic versus other organisations. And it becomes very distinctive, and it needs to be sort of something that you bear in mind all the time, and people expect respect for the voluntary time and the free donations that they give, and one has to respect that.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, that issue of respecting, and at board level, the Abbey would like more donors and welcomes more donors and gifts, clearly. But in the way it's doing a particular job. But the board members, like the board of a charity, they're not remunerated. So from my point of view, one of the roles of the chair is to make sure that there's huge respect for the time of board members, that the time is used very well, that the paperwork is very good, that it comes out on time in the right kind of way, and that it's professional as possible, because you're asking very busy people who are in either full-time jobs or running their own businesses or whatever, or they're artists, to basically spend time on this. So it means, I'm kind of very strong on the notion that the quality of the paperwork is crucial. And the question is, only the chair can actually do that in line with the organisation. A board member can say, well, I didn't think that was a very good paper on X, or I don't think we're getting the right financial details that we need for X, Y, Z. Ultimately, the chair has to pass that through. But to me, it is really respect for the board members' time that requires that is very well done.
Maybe to wrap up, any kind of parting contributions you might want to give to our listeners in terms of advice or any other perspectives on the role of a chair that would be helpful?
I think maybe extending the last point Francis made, I think another aspect of all of this is the chair ensures that the relationship between the executive and the non-executive board is a mutually respectful one. I've prior to being a chairman, I've been in lots of boards, and the relationship between the executive and the non-exec board, it varies enormously, from very healthy, very mutually respectful, open, to typically executive, very defensive, and I think that can waste an awful lot of time and produce much less impactful results. The best, and I think that's maybe one where there's probably needs to be more emphasis put on the role of executive senior management to actually embrace the capabilities of boards. There's a lot of talk about how the board carries out its duties. I think that as we all know, an executive can stymie a non-executive board relatively easily.
One thing that we did recently, we had a session on governance and on responsibilities with both the senior management team and the board. And that was very interesting because it meant that it was kind of facilitated, led a series of sessions. What was really interesting about it was that both heard the same language. And I think that's really very important. And one effect it had is that we're now bringing more of the senior management into parts of the board, which had not been the tradition in the Abbey. They came in to talk about their area, but they didn't actually come in to participate. And when I thought about it, I said, why didn't I do that? Because lots of other boards I've been on have been doing this. But because it hadn't been, there was one of those things I didn't reflect on. But hearing the same discussion about the responsibilities of the board, the responsibilities of the management, that communication between the two, it's not the same as hearing it together. So I think those kind of sessions that are shared between board and senior management are really important for the respect factor.
One of the things I see professionally in the market is that a lot of the focus on governance training is on boards. It's not actually on executives how to work with boards.
Yes.
That's a huge deficit in most markets, certainly here in the UK, more so here than the UK.
And I would support Francis's point there about getting the board and management to work together. Yeah. We're doing that in terms of a strategic planning process, very active interaction between the board and management. We're not quite there at the final stages yet, but it certainly has been a very healthy, constructive kind of engagement, and there's a kind of a common purpose, common cause becoming quite clear, and a certain clarity around what we really want to achieve going forward. So I agree with that entirely. And the management teams like that respect of a board and vice versa. So I think it works both ways, and it is to the organisation's benefit.
So I'd like to thank Dermot, Francis and John for coming along here today to share their experience. Stay tuned for more podcasts on corporate governance and the governance company, the go-to organisation for online and offline corporate governance services globally. Our website address is www.governance-company.com. Thank you.